Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We're going to be going through this report called 11 Trends in Philanthropy for 2025.
Right.
It's from the Dorothy A. Johnson Center for Philanthropy at Grand Valley State University.
Hmm.
And it's a really interesting report.
It is.
It's got all this stuff about, the future of giving and all kinds of different trends that are affecting
Shaping the landscape.
philanthropy.
Yeah.
And we're just going to go through a few of the ones that we found most interesting.
Yeah, some of the more impactful ones, I think.
Yeah.
You know, the ones that'll really kind of maybe make people think differently about how they give or how they engage with nonprofits.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So yeah, it's a really interesting report. It doesn't just kind of like throw out predictions.
Mm-hmm.
It tries to understand why these changes are happening.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
like from societal shifts.
Yeah.
Are we, living longer? Are we, more connected online? And then also like economic realities too.
Yeah.
We've got this like looming tax cliff coming in 2025. All these changes from the 2017 tax law that are expiring.
Right.
So yeah, it kind of paints a picture of a sector in transition.
Yeah, for sure. And like one of the things that stood out to me was this whole idea that collective giving is about to explode.
Yeah.
It's like projected to double in the next 5 years.
Yeah, that's a huge amount of growth.
It's crazy. Hard to ignore. And like, what is collective giving?
So collective giving is basically when people pool their resources together and give as a group.
Oh, okay.
So, think giving circles or crowdfunding campaigns or even those online platforms where you can like donate to a cause with a bunch of other people.
Gotcha. So it's like strength in numbers kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And the report highlights this research from Michael D. Layton and Adriana Losan-Chabalos.
Okay.
And they found that between 2017 and 2023, nearly 4,000 collective giving groups mobilized 370,000 people.
Wow.
And they donated over $3.1 billion.
That's a lot of money.
It's huge. It's a significant amount of money coming from groups of individuals rather than just big institutions or super wealthy donors.
And what's really interesting is that the research also points out that women are like the driving force behind this.
Absolutely. Yeah. They found that women make up the majority of participants and leaders in these giving circles.
I wonder why that is.
Well, I think it speaks to the power of collaboration and community, which are often values that are really strong in women's circles.
That makes sense.
And I think collective giving provides a way for women to really leverage their networks and their resources to make a bigger impact.
Yeah, I can see that.
But it's not just about women. Collective giving is diversifying philanthropy as a whole.
Okay. How so?
Well, we're seeing a lot more engagement from marginalized communities.
Yeah.
Folks who have traditionally been excluded from those traditional philanthropic circles.
Right.
And that's really exciting because it's changing the face of philanthropy and making it more accessible and inclusive.
Yeah, definitely. And it might even inspire some of our listeners to rethink how they give.
I hope so.
Maybe join a giving circle or, even start one with their friends or family.
Right. It's a great way to get involved and make a difference.
Totally. Okay, so moving on, the report also talks about how nonprofits are becoming more active in lobbying.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
And there are a few key reasons why this is happening.
Yeah, well, the first one is just the sheer growth of the nonprofit sector.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many more organizations operating now than there were even just a decade ago.
Right.
And that means there's a greater need to advocate for this sector's interests, to make sure that nonprofits have a seat at the table when policies are being made that affect them.
That makes sense because if the sector's growing, it needs more resources and more support.
Exactly. And the report points out that these big sector-wide advocacy groups, like Independent Sector, United Way, Worldwide, those kinds of organizations,
Yeah.
they've gotten a lot more sophisticated in their lobbying efforts. They're spending millions of dollars to try to shape policy that affects all nonprofits.
Yeah.
Not just their specific cause.
And then there's that whole thing with the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act.
Right.
That had a big impact on the nonprofit world.
Yeah, it really disincentivized charitable giving for a lot of people.
How so?
Well, it raised the standard deduction, which meant that fewer people were itemizing their deductions.
Okay.
And that meant that the charitable deduction, which is a big incentive for a lot of donors,
Right.
it wasn't as valuable anymore.
So nonprofits are having to work even harder to make up for that lost revenue.
Exactly. And they're realizing that they need to be more proactive in advocating for policies that will protect their funding.
Right, because it's not just about fundraising anymore, it's about shaping the policy landscape.
Exactly.
And the report makes this really interesting point that A lot of the changes from that 2017 law are actually set to expire in 2025,
Oh, right.
which means that there's going to be this huge tax code rewrite.
Yeah.
And nonprofits are realizing that they need to be at the table during that rewrite.
Yeah, they need to make their voices heard.
Right, because it could have a huge impact on their future.
Absolutely.
The report had this really great example of how lobbying directly benefited nonprofits during the pandemic.
Oh, yeah.
Do you remember that whole thing with the Paycheck Protection Program loans?
Yeah.
So apparently there were some lawmakers who wanted to exclude nonprofits from those loans,
Really?
which would have been
That
disastrous.
would have been terrible.
But the lobbying efforts from these sector-wide groups,
Right.
they actually managed to get nonprofits included in the program.
Wow, that's a big win.
It potentially saved something like 4.1 million jobs.
That's incredible.
So it just shows you the power of advocacy.
Yeah, it's a real tangible example of how lobbying can make a difference.
For sure.
And it makes you think, could the nonprofits that you support be involved in these efforts too?
That's a good question. I mean, it's something to think about.
It is. It's not always something that people think about when they think about nonprofits,
Right.
but it's becoming more and more important.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about foundations.
Okay.
This report highlights a trend called the spend down movement,
Yeah.
which is basically when a foundation decides to spend its entire endowment within a set time frame rather than operating in perpetuity.
It's a big shift from the traditional model.
It is, and I think Warren Buffett's decision to have his massive fortune spent down within 10 years of his death was a pretty powerful example of this.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That made headlines.
It did.
And, it's not just billionaires like Buffett who are embracing this idea.
Right.
The report cites research from Elizabeth J. Dale,
Okay.
and she found that the number of family foundations in active spend down increased from 9% to 13% in the past 5 years.
Wow, so it's definitely gaining traction.
Yeah, and over 28% of family foundations are considering it.
It seems like there's this sense of urgency to address current challenges rather than giving out over eternity.
Right, there's this feeling that we need to act now.
And there's some pretty inspiring examples of foundations that have embraced spend down.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like the Atlantic Philanthropies,
Mhm.
they gave away $8 billion over 38 years.
Wow.
And they had a huge impact on a wide range of causes, like peace in Northern Ireland and even supporting the U.S. Affordable Care Act.
That's amazing.
And then there's the Mortimer and Mimi Levitt Foundation.
Yeah?
They're planning to spend $150 million by 2041,
Okay.
which is significantly more than the $20 million they gave out in the previous 20 years.
That's a big increase.
It is, and it seems like there's this belief that focusing on a specific time frame can lead to more strategic and impactful giving.
Yeah, it forces you to really prioritize your goals.
Right.
And be more intentional about your grant making.
It makes you wonder how this trend might affect the nonprofits that we all care about.
Yeah, for sure.
Could it change how they seek funding?
Possibly. Yeah, it might lead to more collaborations or mergers.
Right.
Or it might encourage nonprofits to be more creative in their fundraising efforts.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so we can't talk about philanthropy without talking about taxes.
That's the truth.
And this report highlights this potential tax cliff coming in 2025.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
So basically, a lot of those tax changes from 2017 that we were just talking about, they're set to expire, which means that Congress is going to have to rewrite a big chunk of the tax code.
Yeah, it's going to be a major legislative battle.
It is, and the report points out that this could have huge implications for philanthropy.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, depending on how the tax code is rewritten, it could either make it easier or harder for people to give.
Right.
And the report cites research from Trish Abelow and Jeff Williams.
Okay.
And they suggest that those 2017 changes may have already negatively impacted giving.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen some data that suggests that's the case.
Right. And with this upcoming rewrite, there's a chance that things could get better or worse.
Yeah, it's a pretty critical moment for the sector.
It is, especially when you consider that the report also notes this rise in skepticism towards philanthropy and declining giving rates overall.
Yeah, it's a tough environment.
It is, and it makes you wonder how any potential changes to the tax code might affect your own taxes and your own giving.
Yeah, it's something to keep an eye on for sure.
Definitely. Okay, so let's move on to our final trend for this part of our deep dive.
Okay.
It's all about the future of volunteering.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Volunteering is like the lifeblood of so many organizations.
It is, absolutely.
But the report points out that volunteer rates have been on the decline.
Yeah, It's a troubling trend.
It is. They actually hit historic lows during the pandemic.
Wow.
But thankfully, we're starting to see a rebound.
That's good to hear.
Yeah, but there's still this sense that the way people volunteer is changing.
How so?
Well, the report talks about this rise of what they call bite-sized experiences.
Okay.
So basically, people are looking for shorter, more flexible opportunities to volunteer.
All right. They don't necessarily want to commit to like a weekly shift for a year.
Exactly.
They want something that fits into their busy lives.
It's like the gig economy of volunteering.
Yeah, kind of like that.
And then there's virtual volunteering.
Oh, yeah.
Which has become increasingly popular.
Especially during the pandemic.
Right. And it allows people to contribute from anywhere in the world.
It opens up a whole new world of possibilities.
It does. It means that you don't have to be physically present to make a difference.
And it can be a great option for people with disabilities or mobility issues.
Exactly.
Or people who live in rural areas.
Right. Or even people who just have really busy schedules.
Yes, absolutely.
And the report even talks about this idea of redefining what we consider volunteering.
Oh, interesting.
Like recognizing those informal acts of service that we do in our communities.
Okay.
Like helping a neighbor or supporting a friend.
Right.
Those things matter too.
They do, absolutely. And I think it's important to value those contributions.
Yeah, and the report also highlights the connection between volunteering and giving.
Oh, yeah.
People who volunteer are actually more likely to donate financially.
That makes sense.
Right, because they've already built a relationship with the organization.
They're invested.
Yeah, and they've seen the impact of their work firsthand.
So fostering a culture of volunteering could actually boost overall giving.
Exactly, and that's something that all nonprofits should be thinking about.
Definitely.
So maybe this trend inspires you to explore new ways to contribute your time and talents.
I hope so.
Whether it's a short-term project, a virtual opportunity, or simply lending a hand in your community, there are so many ways to make a difference.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to find something that you're passionate about.
For sure.
Because that's what will keep you engaged and coming back for more.
Absolutely.
And that's what will ultimately make the biggest impact.
I agree. And that wraps up our deep dive into some of the key trends shaping the future of philanthropy.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's been a great conversation.
It has.
And I hope our listeners have found it informative and inspiring.
Me too.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks. It's interesting how, like, the whole landscape of giving is changing, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's not just about those big end-of-year donations anymore.
Right. It's like giving is becoming more of a year-round thing.
Totally.
Yeah.
And the report talks about this trend of giving days.
Oh, yeah.
Like, it's not just about Giving Tuesday anymore.
Right. Giving Tuesday was kind of like an OG giving day.
It was, yeah. It really opened the door for this whole movement.
And now it seems like every organization has their own giving day.
Right. It's like nonprofits, universities, community foundations.
Everyone's getting in on the action.
They're all choosing days that align with their mission.
And trying to rally support.
And you know what? They're actually pretty effective.
Yeah, they are. The report highlights how giving days make online giving super easy.
Yeah.
And they tap into the power of social media.
Totally. It's all about creating that buzz.
And it creates the sense of community around giving.
Right. Like, we're all in this together.
It's really interesting how they're changing the annual giving cycle, too.
Yeah. How so?
Well, traditionally, December was like the big month for donations.
Right.
But these giving days are spreading that activity out throughout the year.
It's like a more consistent stream of revenue.
Yeah, and the report even mentions some organizations are raising a significant chunk of their annual operating budget through these giving days.
Wow.
It's crazy. It's like a concentrated burst of fundraising energy.
But I imagine it takes a lot of work to make a giving day successful.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It can't just be about throwing up a hashtag and hoping for the best.
Right. You need a strategy.
Definitely, organizations need to engage. Their donors have a strong social media plan.
Make sure your website can handle the traffic.
Oh, yeah, that's important. You don't want your site to crash.
Exactly. It's a lot of moving pieces.
But it's cool to see how fundraising is evolving.
It is. It's becoming more about creating these engaging experiences.
And fostering a sense of collective action.
Yeah, like we're all part of something bigger.
Okay, so let's switch gears a bit.
Okay.
The report talks about this growing population of older adults.
Right.
And with people age 65 and over expected to like skyrocket in the next few decades, it makes you wonder if philanthropy can keep up with the demand for services.
That's a really important question.
Right? Things like healthcare, housing, social support.
And the report points out some real concerns.
Like what?
Well, for one, only a small percentage of nonprofits are specifically focused on older adults.
Really?
Yeah, and funding for those services hasn't kept pace with the growing need.
It's like a disconnect.
It is. There's this huge demographic shift happening, but the philanthropic world hasn't quite caught up.
But the report did highlight some encouraging signs.
Oh.
Like the number of grant makers supporting organizations for older adults has increased quite a bit in the past decade.
So there's a recognition of the issue.
Yeah, it seems like philanthropy is starting to pay attention.
That's good to hear.
And there's been this big push to reauthorize and strengthen the Older Americans Act.
Right, which is a key piece of legislation for funding services for older adults.
Exactly. So that's a positive step.
It is, and I think the whole conversation around aging is evolving too.
In what way?
Well, it's becoming less about focusing solely on the challenges of aging,
Right.
and more about recognizing the contributions that older adults make.
And what they still have to offer.
Exactly. It's about creating a society that values aging and allows people to age with dignity and purpose.
I like that.
And philanthropy has a big role to play in making that happen.
Totally. And let's not forget that older adults are also a major source of volunteers and donors.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
So engaging them is vital to the future of the entire sector.
It's about recognizing the value they bring, building those intergenerational connections,
Yeah.
and understanding that everyone has something to offer no matter their age.
Okay, so this next trend might surprise some people.
Oh, really?
What is it?
Funding democracy.
Funding democracy. What does that even mean?
Right. It caught my attention, too, when I was reading the report.
So tell me more. Well, it's basically about supporting organizations that are working to strengthen our democratic institutions and processes.
Okay.
So think voter registration drives efforts to protect elections, fighting misinformation and polarization.
So it's about ensuring that our democracy is actually functioning.
Exactly. And that everyone has a voice in the process.
I see.
And the report points out some key lessons that the movement is learning.
Like what?
Well, for one, funding democracy is a long game.
Okay.
It requires sustained commitment and funding, not just short-term projects.
It's not a quick fix.
Right. It's about investing in the long-term health of our democracy.
That makes sense.
The report also stresses the importance of supporting groups working at all levels of the democratic process.
From grassroots initiatives to national advocacy groups.
Exactly. It takes a diverse ecosystem to create change.
And finally, the report emphasizes the importance of supporting efforts to rebuild trust in our democratic institutions.
Right, because trust is essential for a functioning democracy.
It is. And unfortunately, that trust has been eroding in recent years.
It's definitely something that we need to address.
For sure.
It makes you think about the role philanthropy can play in supporting a healthy democracy.
Yeah. It's a big responsibility.
It is, but it's also an opportunity.
There's real difference.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so the report doesn't shy away from some of the tough realities facing the nonprofit world.
Right. Like what?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is the workforce crisis.
Oh, yeah. That's a big one.
Nonprofits are struggling to attract and retain qualified employees.
And that obviously impacts their ability to serve their communities.
Exactly. And the report lays out several contributing factors.
Like what?
Low pay, limited benefits, burnout.
It's a challenging environment to work in,
It is. So many people are passionate about the work.
but they're feeling overworked and undervalued.
Exactly.
And the pandemic really exacerbated this problem.
It did. Nonprofits were on the front lines dealing with increased demand for services.
Right.
While also facing staffing shortages and budget constraints.
It was a perfect storm.
It really was.
Yeah.
So how do we address this?
Well, the report suggests that philanthropy can play a part.
Okay.
Funders can provide more unrestricted funding.
Which would give nonprofits more flexibility.
Exactly. They could use that funding to invest in things like staff salaries, benefits, professional development.
It's about recognizing that a strong workforce is essential for creating real impact.
Totally. And the report also encourages nonprofits to prioritize their employees' well-being,
Okay.
creating a workplace culture that values work-life balance, provides mental health support, offers opportunities for growth.
It sounds like a win-win.
It is. A healthy and supported workforce is ultimately good for everyone.
Totally. It's about recognizing that those employees are the heart of the sector.
Right.
And that their well-being is directly connected to the effectiveness of their organizations.
Couldn't agree more.
It's interesting how the report talks about the whole landscape of social justice philanthropy.
Yeah, that's a really important area and a complex one too,
It is, and it's evolving so rapidly, especially with all the political and social changes happening around us.
Definitely. I mean, the report points out that there was this surge in philanthropic support for social justice initiatives after the murder of George Floyd in 2020.
Right. It was like everyone was making pledges and commitment.
Exactly. Foundations, corporations, individuals.
But the report also acknowledges that the momentum has kind of slowed down since then.
Yeah, it seems like the initial outpouring of support hasn't necessarily translated into sustained funding.
Why do you think that is?
Well, the report suggests a couple of factors.
Okay.
One is the increasing political polarization in our country.
Right. It seems like everything is viewed through a partisan lens these days.
Exactly. And that includes social justice?
So some people might see support for social justice as a political statement rather than a moral imperative.
Right. And then there's been this noticeable backlash against diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts.
Oh, yeah. We've seen that in legislation, lawsuits, even attacks on DEI programs.
Especially in higher education.
Right. Like the Supreme Court's decision to strike down affirmative action.
That was a big one.
The report actually highlights that decision as a turning point.
It seems like it emboldened those who oppose DEI efforts.
And created a climate of uncertainty for organizations committed to social justice.
Like they're trying to figure out how to navigate this new landscape.
Right. Some seem to be holding firm to their commitments.
While others are taking a more cautious approach.
Maybe even dialing back their public stance on social justice.
It's a tough situation for sure.
The report also points out that foundations led by people of color are more likely to be having these conversations.
About these developments.
Yeah, both internally and with their grantees.
It raises the question of whose voices are being prioritized in all of this.
That's a good point. It's a reminder that representation and diverse perspectives are crucial when it comes to shaping the direction of social justice philanthropy.
Absolutely. So where do we go from here?
Right. What does the report say?
Well, it doesn't offer any easy answers, but it emphasizes the importance of continuing the conversation.
And staying engaged in the work.
Exactly. Social justice is a long-term commitment.
Not just a reaction to a specific event.
Right. It's about addressing systemic issues.
Working towards a more just and equitable world.
Even in the face of challenges and pushback.
Absolutely. Well, this has been an incredible deep dive into the future of philanthropy.
It has. It's given us a lot to think about.
It really has. We've covered so much ground.
From the rise of collective giving and new approaches to funding,
to the challenges facing the nonprofit workforce and the evolving landscape of social justice philanthropy.
It's clear that the philanthropic world is in a state of transition.
And that these trends have real implications for how we give, how we engage in our communities, and how we work together to create a better future.
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that philanthropy is not a static thing.
Right. It's constantly evolving.
And we need to be adaptable and responsive to the changing needs of our world.
Absolutely. Well said. I want to thank you for joining me on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. We hope you found this conversation insightful and thought-provoking.
And we encourage you to continue exploring these trends and thinking about how they might shape your own relationship with philanthropy.
Thanks again for listening.